What happens when an army is ordered to fight to the last man? For the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, this wasn't a hypothetical. It was a grim reality. Surrounded, starving, freezing, and yet forbidden to surrender, their fate was sealed. But the story doesn't stop there. What about the Soviet soldiers standing their ground and the civilians caught in between? The Battle of Stalingrad was more than warfare. It was survival at its bleakest. Welcome back everyone, glad to see you again. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like, comment where you're listening from, and what your dream is in life. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. Why would Hitler risk everything for Stalingrad? After all, it was just one city. But to him, and Stalin, it was much more than that. It was a symbol. For Hitler, taking a city named after his enemy would have been the ultimate propaganda victory, a way to humiliate Stalin publicly and send the message that Soviet resistance was futile. And for Stalin, losing Stalingrad wasn't an option. It wasn't just his name on the map. It was a statement about Soviet strength and endurance. Strategically, Stalingrad was a tremendous prize. It sat on the Volga River, which was more than just a long winding stripe on a map. The Volga was a transportation lifeline that connected the eastern and western parts of the Soviet Union. Imagine every supply convoy, every shipment of food, weapons and reinforcement troops flowing through this artery. If Hitler's forces captured Stalingrad, they'd effectively choke off this lifeline and cripple the Soviet war effort. And it wasn't just about cutting off supplies. The city's location was also a stepping stone. Take Stalingrad, and the path to the rich oil fields of the Caucasus opened up. Oil was the fuel of modern war, quite literally, and the German war machine was running dangerously low on it. But then, as it often went with Hitler, practicality gave way to obsession. Originally, Germany's plan, known as Operation Blue, aimed to focus on securing the Caucasus oil fields. Stalingrad wasn't the main target. It was a secondary objective. That didn't last. Hitler grew fixated on the idea of taking Stalingrad, viewing it as a symbolic victory so significant that it justified reshuffling his entire strategy. He ordered his armies to split their forces, pursuing both the oil fields and the city at the same time, which stretched resources and created gaps in his defences. Imagine trying to build 2 skyscrapers at once with the materials for just one. Something was bound to collapse, and as risky as this decision was, Hitler pushed it further. Even when commanders on the ground pointed out that splitting his armies left both vulnerable, he was unwavering. Stalingrad had to fall, no matter how much it cost. This obsession played right into Stalin's hands. He knew the Soviets couldn't afford to lose the city, not just for its strategic importance, but for its power as a rallying cry. Stalin issued Order Number 227, also known as Not One Step Back. There were no exceptions. Every soldier was ordered to hold their position, and those who failed would face trials and in many cases execution. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. Soviet troops fought harder, knowing there was no choice but to stand their ground. This wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers. Civilians were pulled into the fray as well. Stalin refused to evacuate the citizens of Stalingrad, believing their presence would motivate the soldiers to fight even more fiercely. He wasn't wrong, but it came at an unimaginable cost. Families stayed in their homes, enduring artillery shelling, bombings and sniper fire as their city turned into a battleground. Some even took up arms themselves, defending their neighbourhoods and factories alongside the Red Army. The city itself became a fortress as much as it did a battlefield. But here's what made it different from other battles: the propaganda stakes on both sides. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad was the big headline he needed to rejuvenate German morale and prove to the world, and maybe to himself, that the Axis powers were unstoppable. Losing the city, on the other hand, would have been a public humiliation, and Hitler wasn't exactly known for his humility. Meanwhile, Stalin leaned into the idea that Stalingrad was the heart of Soviet strength, a place that could endure anything Hitler threw at it. The battle turned into a loudspeaker for both sides, each trying to outdo the other in convincing their people and their armies that victory was inevitable. This isn't to say Hitler had no rationale behind his obsession with the city. The industrial capacity alone made Stalingrad a tempting target. Its factories were producing weapons, tractors, and other war materials critical to the Soviet effort. But fixating on symbolism over strategy doesn't usually end well, especially when your logistics are already stretched thin. Hitler's insistence on holding multiple objectives at once didn't just put pressure on his armies, it caused cracks to form in the entire endeavour. As his forces approached Stalingrad, supply lines grew thinner and more vulnerable. The further they advanced, the harder it became to keep troops fed, fueled and armed. This logistical nightmare would come back to haunt them as the battle dragged on. Stalin's forces had their own problems. Defending Stalingrad at all costs wasn't just a political move, it was a gamble. The Soviet army wasn't prepared to face the full force of the Wehrmacht. Early on, they faced devastating blows, retreating from key positions to regroup and reinforce. But unlike Hitler, Stalin was patient. His generals were allowed to execute a strategy centered on time, stalling the Germans, forcing them to commit more and more resources to take the city. Every street the Soviets lost was a street their enemy bled to gain. The deeper Hitler's forces dove into the fight for Stalingrad, the harder it became for them to extricate themselves. It was like quicksand. Retreat wasn't an option, but going forward was just as disastrous. German confidence had been built on quick, decisive victories. The idea that blitzkrieg could steamroll over any resistance. But Stalingrad was no battlefield, it was a grinder. Every plan the Germans had for a swift victory unraveled the moment their tanks and troops were funneled into a city where every building, every corner, every pile of rubble became a defensible position. By committing so heavily to one city, the Germans essentially put all their eggs in one crumbling, war-torn basket. When things started going south, they couldn't just cut their losses and leave. Hitler wouldn't allow it. And so Stalingrad became a trap, but not the kind the Germans had set out to create. They were locking themselves into a battle they weren't prepared to win, a point of prestige that was quickly losing all sense of strategic value. Every decision made from that point on was a reaction to the last disaster, a horrible cycle of throwing more resources into a fight they couldn't afford to lose, even as it became increasingly clear they couldn't win. Symbolism, strategy, survival — this was Stalingrad in a nutshell. It wasn't just a battle, it was a statement, a gamble, and most of all, a warning about the cost of pride and obsession. And as Hitler's gamble turned into an all-consuming fight for control, a new reality emerged for anyone on the ground in Stalingrad. Survival itself became a different kind of war. What happens when a city becomes a war zone? It stops being a city. Roads and parks turn into killing grounds. Factories and schools become sniper nests. Every inch of ground, every wall that's still standing, gets fought over, again and again. In Stalingrad, this transformation began on August 23, 1942, when the German Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing campaign. Wave after wave of bombers rolled over the city, dropping more than 1,000 tons of explosives. What had been a bustling industrial centre by the Volga River was reduced to rubble in just hours. Buildings were flattened, homes were incinerated, and in the chaos, an estimated 40,000 civilians were killed. For the Germans, this was supposed to cripple Soviet resistance. Instead, they created the perfect battlefield for urban warfare. A nightmare of debris and ruins where tanks were almost useless and every street corner hid a potential ambush. As the dust settled, what was left of Stalingrad didn't look much like a city anymore. Wide avenues were blocked by the shattered buildings. Factories once churning out tanks and weapons were now hollowed-out skeletons. The rail yards, crucial to moving supplies, were a twisted mass of steel and rubble. And yet, among this destruction, the Soviets saw opportunity. The ruins became their shield, their weapon, their home. Defenders turned bombed-out apartments into bunkers, filling windows and doorways with machine guns. They buried sniper teams into basements or propped them on the broken beams of abandoned buildings. Every collapsed wall or pile of bricks became another position to hold or another trap to spring on the advancing Germans. For the soldiers on both sides, this was a new kind of warfare. The Germans had made their reputation with blitzkrieg, quick, coordinated attacks in open terrain. Stalingrad turned that strategy on its head. Giant panzer tanks sat idle, unable to maneuver through the narrow, debris-strewn streets. Artillery barrages were less effective in a city already smashed to bits. Instead of sweeping frontal assaults, troops had to fight their way through a hellish maze. Hitler's army resorted to painstakingly clearing buildings room by room, floor by floor. Even that wasn't straightforward. Some of those contested buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day, with soldiers charging up one staircase while others retreated down another. What happens when a city becomes a war zone? It stops being a city. Roads and parks turn into killing grounds. Factories and schools become sniper nests. Every inch of ground, every wall that's still standing, gets fought over. Again and again. In Stalingrad, this transformation began on August 23, 1942, when the German Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing campaign. Wave after wave of bombers rolled over the city, dropping more than 1,000 tons of explosives. What had been a bustling industrial centre by the Volga River was reduced to rubble in just hours. Buildings were flattened, homes were incinerated, and in the chaos, an estimated 40,000 civilians were killed. For the Germans, this was supposed to cripple Soviet resistance. Instead, they created the perfect battlefield for urban warfare. A nightmare of debris and ruins where tanks were almost useless and every street corner hid a potential ambush. As the dust settled, what was left of Stalingrad didn't look much like a city anymore. Wide avenues were blocked by the shattered buildings. Factories once churning out tanks and weapons were now hollowed-out skeletons. The rail yards, crucial to moving supplies, were a twisted mass of steel and rubble. And yet, among this destruction, the Soviets saw opportunity. The ruins became their shield, their weapon, their home. Defenders turned bombed-out apartments into bunkers, filling windows and doorways with machine guns. They buried sniper teams into basements or propped them on the broken beams of abandoned buildings. Every collapsed wall or pile of bricks became another position to hold or another trap to spring on the advancing Germans. For the soldiers on both sides, this was a new kind of warfare. The Germans had made their reputation with blitzkrieg, quick, coordinated attacks in open terrain. Stalingrad turned that strategy on its head. Giant panzer tanks sat idle, unable to maneuver through the narrow, debris-strewn streets. Artillery barrages were less effective in a city already smashed to bits. Instead of sweeping frontal assaults, troops had to fight their way through a hellish maze. Hitler's army resorted to painstakingly clearing buildings room by room, floor by floor. Even that wasn't straightforward. Some of those contested buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day, with soldiers charging up one staircase while others retreated down another. Then there were the ambushes. The Soviets would hide tanks among the rubble, waiting for German soldiers or vehicles to pass by unsuspectingly before opening fire. Soldiers laid traps in alleyways or abandoned stores, using whatever they had available: grenades, explosives, even just sheer surprise. Germans, unfamiliar with this kind of fighting, found themselves caught in pitfalls of their own making, their confidence in superior equipment undermined by the sheer adaptability of their opponents. Civilians too became part of the battle, though rarely by choice. Many had refused or were unable to evacuate before the bombing began. They hid in basements, dug makeshift shelters under collapsed homes, and endured the daily bombardment and sniper fire just to survive another day. Some were recruited or volunteered to fight, a factory worker handing a rifle to their neighbour, or entire families barricading windows and setting traps. Others became the tragic collateral damage of a battle fought with little regard for innocence. As the front lines constantly shifted, entire neighbourhoods disappeared into the chaos of war. A single square foot could be ruled by Germans in the morning and reclaimed by Soviets by nightfall, only for the cycle to repeat again the next day. The omnipresent combat frayed the nerves of even the most hardened soldiers. The Germans in particular faced frustration and exhaustion. Every new building became a fresh fight, every new corner a potential death sentence. As winter began its approach, conditions in the city grew even worse, making the battlefield even deadlier. Stalingrad symbolized the purest form of attrition. It wasn't about strategy or sweeping offenses anymore. It was about survival in one of the most inhospitable terrains imaginable. Not a jungle, not a desert, but a city shattered beyond recognition. For the Germans, their vaunted blitzkrieg had turned into slow, grinding combat that drained resources and morale. For the Soviets, the landscape gave them just enough of an advantage to start pushing back, inch by bloody inch. The rubble had changed everything. It gave Stalingrad its identity in the battle, a city that didn't just hold its ground but forced the fight onto its terms. But as bad as the constant fighting was, something far worse was on its way. The Russian winter was about to show both armies that Stalingrad wasn't done taking its toll. If the bullets didn't kill you, the cold just might. By late 1942, winter tightened its grip on Stalingrad, and with it came a new kind of horror that neither the Germans nor the Soviets could escape. Temperatures plummeted to as low as 30 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Picture a vast landscape of snow and ice, broken only by the eerie stillness of the ruins, where every breath you took turned into frost on your scarf, if you were lucky enough to have one. In this Arctic wasteland, the fight wasn't just against the enemy anymore, it was against nature itself. For the Germans, the winter was a cruel wake-up call. Their entire campaign had banked on the idea of a quick victory, blitzing through Soviet territory before the weather could turn. Instead, they found themselves stuck in a frozen city, unprepared and unequipped to handle the brutal Russian winter. Many of their uniforms were designed for the warmer climates of Western Europe, offering little protection from the frost. Soldiers wore thin, ill-fitting coats and boots that provided no insulation. Some resorted to tearing curtains from shattered windows or stuffing hay into their clothes just to stay warm. But survival hacks like that only went so far when frostbite set in. Tips of fingers and toes turned black, then fell off. Noses and ears froze, the skin splitting painfully. It wasn't uncommon to find men who had lost entire limbs to the cold. And it wasn't just frostbite. Hypothermia became a silent killer. For hours or even days, soldiers trying to sleep would slowly freeze to death, their bodies discovered stiff and lifeless under thin blankets. The cold also attacked in other ways, disrupting essential equipment and grinding operations to a halt. The lubricants in their weapons thickened and froze, jamming rifles and machine guns in the heat of battle. Tanks and vehicles sputtered and failed to start, leaving troops stranded. Even basic tasks like lighting a fire or opening a ration tin with numb hands became Herculean efforts. Supply lines, which were already stretched thin because of the encirclement, broke down almost entirely in the icy conditions. Food, ammunition, medicine, you name it, stalled somewhere far from the front lines. The German army found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to rely on consistent deliveries. This breakdown wasn't just an inconvenience, it tipped the psychological scales. Imagine trying to fight for your life while also wondering whether you'd freeze, starve, or both. By contrast, the Soviets had, shall we say, a bit more experience with this kind of thing. After all, the Russian winter was as much a part of their identity as borscht and vodka. They'd fought against Napoleon under similar conditions, and their army knew the value of preparation. Soviet troops were issued proper winter gear, heavy quilted coats, felt-lined boots, and padded caps to protect their ears. They also knew how to adapt their tactics to the cold, using skis to move supplies or slipping quietly across the snowy streets under cover of winter storms. The Soviets weren't invincible, though. The cold didn't discriminate. Frostbite and hypothermia still claimed many lives on their side as well, but it's fair to say they fared better than the Germans. The winter did more than just freeze soldiers in their tracks. It drained the will to fight. For months, troops had already been locked in a grueling urban meat grinder, and now the cold seeped into their bones, sapping what little morale remained. In the words of German soldier William Hoffmann, "Our strength is ebbing away. Only the dead can hope for peace now." You can almost feel the exhaustion in his writing. The unrelenting cold turned every task into a test of endurance. If you could aim your rifle without your hands shaking violently, you were fortunate. If you could march without your feet breaking apart in frostbitten agony, even better. It wasn't just the physical toll. The cold waged psychological warfare too. Nights were the worst. In the ruined cityscape, the faint sounds of enemy patrols mingled with the eerie howling of winter winds. Small fires burned palely in pits dug into the rubble, but they gave little warmth and often made you a target for snipers. Men huddled together for body heat, trying to ignore the gnawing pain in their limbs, praying for some kind of relief that never came. And then there were the weapons, supposedly the tools of survival. In the cold, they became unreliable at best, useless at worst. German machine guns froze solid, and soldiers had to warm parts of their rifles with their hands just to get a shot off. Soviet rifles were slightly better, but even they jammed frequently, the moisture from breath turning into ice on the mechanisms. Reloading with frozen fingers, fumbling with ammunition, was another lethal challenge. Fighting under these conditions often meant hand-to-hand combat, a visceral, desperate scramble to kill before you were killed. For those lucky enough to find shelter in basements or dugouts, conditions weren't much better. The lucky ones had stoves, but fuel was scarce. Soldiers burned anything they could find, scraps of the wood, broken chairs, even of books, in an attempt to chase away the biting cold. In some areas, desperation led to horrifying scenes. Dead horses, frozen stiff in the snow, weren't just landmarks on the battlefield. They became both firewood and food. That leads us to supplies, or rather, the lack of them. Winter shut down many of the already struggling supply lines. The Germans, who had been relying on air-dropped provisions, saw fewer parcels arrive as winds and icy runways made air missions increasingly dangerous and unreliable. Starvation added another layer to the suffering. Food froze instantly and rations grew smaller and smaller until for many they disappeared entirely. Men tossed aside military discipline to gorge themselves on what little they could scavenge. William Hoffman's diary is filled with mentions of these struggles. "We eat what we can find, even the bark from trees," he wrote at one point. Imagine the indignity of gnawing on bark or chewing frozen scraps of meat while the enemy waited to kill you just outside. The Soviets, though better prepared, still struggled to keep their supply lines open too. Starvation, frostbite and exhaustion claimed thousands of lives on their side as well. But they were fighting a different kind of battle, the kind where every hardship endured still felt like progress because it weakened an invader. The Soviets saw the cold as an ally. To them, every German that succumbed to frostbite or hypothermia was one less soldier they'd need to kill. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, its damage had already been done. The cold didn't fire a single bullet, but it massacred soldiers on both sides. For the Germans, it wasn't just a harsh season. It was the beginning of the end, the final straw on an already doomed campaign. And for the exhausted survivors shivering in their tattered uniforms, the worst part of the nightmare was far from over. While the cold may have subsided, hunger was waiting patiently to finish the job. And if you think winter was cruel, starvation was an enemy in a league of its own. Imagine this: you've gone days without eating, your stomach aches constantly, the pain sharp at first but dulling over time into an empty hollow sensation. Now, add the sounds of gunfire and the freezing grip of a Russian winter. This was reality for thousands trapped in Stalingrad, soldiers and civilians alike. As the fighting dragged on, starvation wasn't just another hardship, it became an ever-present enemy gnawing away at bodies and minds. Both the German and Soviet forces relied on supply lines that, under normal conditions, would feed their troops and keep them fighting. But Stalingrad was anything but normal. As the Germans advanced into the city, their stretched supply chains began failing. Soviet forces, recognizing the strategic importance of isolating the invaders, did everything they could to cut those lines entirely. On the other side, the German encirclement of Stalingrad cut the city's inhabitants off from the outside world. What was supposed to be a decisive victory for the Germans devolved into a war of attrition, where food was as valuable as ammunition, and just as scarce. With supply lines severed, both armies were forced to scavenge, invent and endure in ways that go beyond what most of us can imagine. For the Germans, this meant turning to unconventional and often horrifying sources of food. Otto Zeitig, a German soldier, wrote in a letter about the troops resorting to eating cats. Yes, cats. The same animals that might have been cherished pets were now dinner, if you were lucky enough to catch one. Others weren't so fortunate and had to resort to boiling strips of leather from belts or boots, trying to extract some semblance of nutrition. And in some cases, when the situation grew even worse, soldiers reportedly ate whatever they could find, anything to fend off death for another day. The desperation wasn't confined to the soldiers. Civilians in Stalingrad lived through almost impossible levels of suffering, trapped between two armies and relentless hunger. Imagine living in a city reduced to rubble, bombs dropping all around, and terrifying sniper fire keeping you from ever feeling safe. Now add an empty pantry and limited access to any form of relief. With markets destroyed and no time to grow food, those still in the city were left to fend for themselves in unimaginably grim ways. Valentina Savalieva, a civilian survivor, recounted eating clay just to fill her stomach. Can you picture what kind of desperation that takes? To choke down dirt, hoping it might quiet your body's cries for nourishment. Of course, scenes of starvation weren't unique to civilians. German soldiers, often idealized as the pride of the Wehrmacht, were brought to their knees by hunger. Bernhard Beckler, one of the German troops stationed in Stalingrad, described hacking meat from frozen horses and boiling it just to have something to eat. In his words, "We had nothing to eat. We were just lying there without any food, almost frozen to death." It wasn't a story of heroism, but of raw, gut-wrenching survival. Several accounts noted that before even entering Stalingrad, the Sixth Army was already eating its horses. Think about that. A force expected to overrun the city was starving before they'd even begun their fight. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers weren't faring much better. The Red Army was just as cut off from proper supplies in many cases. Yet they carried on, largely because the punitive Soviet system didn't allow surrender as an option. If hunger didn't kill you, failure might lead to a firing squad. Day by day, the effects of starvation became more evident, especially on the battlefield. Hunger wasn't just a physical challenge. Sure, it consumed fat and muscle, leaving soldiers frail and slow, but it also tore apart their ability to think clearly, turning orders into mumbled confusion and decisions into fatal mistakes. A hungry soldier marching through the streets of Stalingrad wasn't only battling the enemy, he was battling himself, each step heavier than the one before, each hour an eternity. Without the strength to lift their rifles, soldiers often couldn't even defend themselves, let alone charge forward. Starvation turned professional squads into walking skeletons. Hunger also rotted morale. Early in the campaign, William Hoffmann, a young German soldier, wrote optimistically to his family about the strength and glory of his comrades. But as days turned to weeks, his diary entries grew darker, filled with despair over food shortages and hopelessness about ever seeing home again. "We eat what we can find," he wrote in one entry, "even the bark from trees." Did he write that with resignation? Or was hunger the one thing that kept him hopeful for even scraps of bark? Meanwhile, civilians, often forgotten in the shadow of military accounts, bore an equal, if not greater, brunt of this suffering. For most, survival came down to luck. Did you find a hidden bag of flour among the ruins? Did you have a relative who worked in a factory and could sneak scraps of food home? Those who didn't find help scavenged, picking through the rubble for anything even remotely edible. It was common to see people pulling strips of frozen horse meat, buried in snow from the streets after fighting subsided, even as fresh bullets flew overhead. And yes, there are accounts of people resorting to eating the corpses of those who hadn't survived the endless bombings or frost. It's a horrible thing to think about, but war doesn't care about shame or human dignity. All of this paints one of the grimmest pictures you can imagine. The starvation that gripped Stalingrad was an equal opportunity oppressor, striking soldiers and civilians, Soviets and Nazis indiscriminately. By some estimates, nearly 250,000 soldiers starved, froze, or succumbed to illnesses caused by the fighting's brutal living conditions. For civilians, no one knows precisely how many lives hunger claimed, but it's safe to say this was a battle that left few mouths fed when the dust finally settled. Starvation wasn't a byproduct of war here. It was as integral to the siege as the snipers and the tank shells. And yet, through all of this suffering, through the frostbite, the hunger and the misery, the fighting didn't stop. In fact, it only grew fiercer. As weakness turned to delirium and desperation overshadowed all sense, adapting to survive became the only rule in Stalingrad. For the soldiers and civilians who endured it, survival wasn't just an instinct. It was a test of what the human body and spirit could withstand. When brute force isn't enough and survival is the only thing that matters, war changes. The rules don't just bend, they vanish. In Stalingrad, this was an everyday reality. The Germans entered the city expecting to crush their Soviet enemies with firepower, armour, and air support, like they'd done countless times before. What they got was something completely different. A brutal close-quarters death trap where every step forward might be their last. Stalingrad turned into the ultimate lesson in urban warfare. Adapt, or you die. The first challenge was the setting itself. After the initial bombing campaign had left Stalingrad in ruins, it wasn't a functioning city anymore. It was a jagged, smoke-covered maze. Every pile of rubble, every collapsed building was both a hiding spot and a weapon. The Soviets weren't just fighting in the city, they made it their ally. Ruins became their battleground of choice, and the strategies the Red Army used exploited every advantage this destruction offered. Take their tactic of hugging the enemy. They moved their front line close, sometimes within meters, of German positions. Why? When your soldiers are practically next door to the enemy, it becomes almost impossible for them to call in effective artillery or airstrikes without risking their own men. It was simple, brutal, and clever. By staying close, the Soviets forced the Germans to fight on their terms, man-to-man, up close, and without the luxury of overwhelming firepower. And close combat was exactly where the Soviets thrived. Urban warfare wasn't something the Germans were prepared for. They'd been trained for precision movements across open terrain, tanks pushing forward, air support softening targets, infantry flanking the enemy. None of that worked on Stalingrad streets. Large armoured vehicles couldn't navigate the narrow, debris-filled streets. Artillery strikes were just as likely to land on German units as Soviet ones. And so the Germans were stuck clearing buildings room by room, floor by floor, sometimes fighting hand to hand. They didn't just face bullets, they faced grenades tossed from upper floors, ambushes appearing out of nowhere, and even knife fights in dark corridors. Every moment was tense, every building was a trap. The Soviets didn't just use the environment, they turned it into a weapon. Fallen ceilings became barricades. Basements became sniper nests. They formed small squads known as storm groups, designed specifically for clearing and holding buildings. Each group consisted of 4 to 8 men, armed with submachine guns, grenades, and whatever else they could carry. Their missions weren't grand offensives, they were focused, meticulous attacks. Imagine creeping through a city at night, barely able to see your enemy, knowing that around the next corner might be a German soldier with a flamethrower. That was the reality of these squads, tasked with hunting down enemy one street, one house, sometimes one room at a time, and the Germans weren't helpless victim in this chaotic environment. They adapted too, though often too little and too late. One tactic they favoured was the use of flamethrowers to clean out Soviet strongholds. A building too well fortified to storm directly. Set it on fire. The choking smoke could force Soviet defenders out into the open, where they'd be exposed and vulnerable to rifle fire. Flamethrowers weren't just a weapon, they were psychological. Few things are more terrifying in warfare than facing a soldier armed with a fire-spitting weapon, capable of burning everything around you in seconds. Still, these high-tech weapons couldn't erase the daily reality of urban combat, where ingenuity often mattered more than gear. The Soviets hid tanks under piles of rubble, waiting for German patrols to wander into view before ambushing them point blank. Meanwhile, German forces learned to inspect every door and window for booby traps. Tripwires connected to explosives were a regular hazard. Any movement through the city had to be slow and deliberate. Rushing could mean death. The sniper war deserves its own mention. Both sides deployed snipers, but the Soviets in particular made a lasting impression. The name Vasily Zaitsev stands out, an expert marksman with 25 confirmed kills during the battle. Imagine crawling into position, lying perfectly still for hours in snow and rubble, your breath barely visible as you wait for one wrong move from your target. For German patrols, it wasn't just about spotting deadly snipers. It was about surviving the psychological weight of knowing you were being watched, hunted, every second. A single careless step into an open street could mean death. Then there were the moments of chaos where rules and plans disintegrated completely. The Soviets famously fortified the city's railway yard, which changed hands multiple times in a single day. Think about that for a second. Imagine fighting tooth and nail to claim a single stretch of ground, only to lose it hours later, and then start the process over again. For the soldiers involved, victories were fleeting, and the cost of each was devastating. Neither side had the resources or strength to hold positions for long, but both kept coming back, grinding each other down day by day, metre by metre. And in all of this, luck played its part. Survival often depended on whose grenade detonated first, whose rifle jammed at the wrong moment, or who managed to find shelter in the nick of time. It was a grinding, soul-crushing form of war, where progress was measured in feet rather than miles, and soldiers couldn't afford to think of battles in terms of grand strategies anymore. Victory wasn't even a clear concept. It was just about staying alive a little longer than the other side. For the Germans, this kind of fighting took a toll they weren't built for. They weren't just at war with the Red Army. They were at war with frustration, fatigue, and a battlefield that seemed to favour the Soviets at every turn. Their equipment and training, once their greatest strengths, became liabilities. Tanks, airplanes, artillery, they meant little in the cramped, rubble-filled streets of Stalingrad. And as they struggled to adapt, the Soviets grew stronger, more inventive, and more determined to hold their ground. Stalingrad didn't invent urban warfare, but it did redefine it. It showed the world how a city could swallow armies whole, turning the tools of a modern military into little more than dead weight. By the time the fighting neared its climax, the city wasn't just a battleground, it was a graveyard for grand ambitions and misguided strategies. And yet something even bigger loomed ahead. While German soldiers fought for survival on the ground, the Soviets were weaving a plan that would spring a trap Hitler's forces were too distracted to see coming. What happens when an entire army gets surrounded with no way out? For the German Sixth Army, it started on November 19th, 1942, with a sound that would echo in their nightmares: artillery fire. The Soviets had launched Operation Uranus, their long-planned counteroffensive, and the Germans were caught completely off guard. But this wasn't just another firefight in the ruins of Stalingrad. This was something much bigger. An encirclement strategy designed to trap the entire Sixth Army and crush the Axis forces holding the city. Here's how the Soviets pulled it off. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified German positions in Stalingrad head-on, because let's be honest, that would have been pointless, they targeted the weaker flanks. Now these flanks weren't guarded by elite German soldiers. Instead, they were manned by Axis allies, Romanian, Italian and Hungarian troops. Under-equipped, under-trained and facing brutal conditions, these soldiers stood no chance against the massive Soviet assault. And it wasn't just infantry charging at them. The Soviets came in with tanks, mechanized infantry and artillery in terrifying waves, overwhelming the defenders in just days. By November 20th, the two pincers of the Soviet attack were closing in fast, and on November 23rd, they linked up near the town of Kalach, roughly 60 miles from Stalingrad. With that, the encirclement, known as the Kessel or cauldron, was complete. Inside the cauldron lay roughly 300,000 Axis troops. That number didn't just include the German Sixth Army, but also elements of the 4th Panzer Army and their remaining Romanian allies. Now you'd think the logical move here would have been a retreat. Cut your losses, regroup, live to fight another day. And in fact, Germany's own generals like Erich von Manstein begged Hitler to allow General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, to break out of the encirclement. They wanted to send the army westward, linking up with other German forces. But in one of the most catastrophic decisions of the war, Hitler refused. For him, retreat wasn't just an option, it was humiliation. Stalingrad was a symbolic prize, a city named after his greatest enemy, and losing it would shatter the image of German dominance. So instead of retreating, Paulus was ordered to stand his ground. And here's where things went from bad to worse. Hitler promised Paulus that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would resupply the encircled troops by air. Supplies like food, ammunition and medical aid would be airlifted in daily to keep the army functioning. At least that was the plan. The man behind this promise? Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. Göring claimed that his squadrons could deliver 300 tons of supplies to Stalingrad every day, just enough to sustain the army. But his numbers were less military calculation and more wishful thinking. The reality was that the Luftwaffe barely managed to deliver 80 tons per day, less than a third of what was needed. Planes were shot down by Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft guns, and those that did make it often brought supplies that were near useless. Summer clothing, luxury items, or medical equipment with no one to properly use it. It was like tossing a bucket of water on a roaring inferno. Inside the cauldron, conditions quickly became unbearable. The Axis troops ran out of food and starvation swept through the encircled army. We're not talking about slightly smaller rations or men skipping a meal. We're talking about soldiers so hungry they boiled leather for soup. Ammunition for weapons ran dangerously low, leaving frontline troops with little more than bayonets or sheer desperation. Injured soldiers crowded into makeshift hospitals, but received little to no care because medical supplies were long gone. And then there was the cold. Temperatures dropped to deadly lows, and most troops didn't have proper winter clothing. Imagine trying to defend your life while wrapped in thin uniforms, your hands frozen, and the air so cold it felt like shards of glass with every breath. Although the German High Command scrambled to organise a possible breakout or relief effort, nothing came together in time. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a counteroffensive, known as Operation Winter Storm, to break through the Soviet lines and reach the Sixth Army. But while his forces made progress, they never came close to Stalingrad itself. The Soviets were ready for every move the Germans made, reinforcing their lines and ensuring the encirclement remained intact. Back in the cauldron, time was running out. Paulus asked for permission to abandon the city and fight his way out with whatever strength his men had left. Hitler's response? No retreat. Paulus and his men were to stay until the bitter end. By late January 1943, the situation had become hopeless. The Sixth Army wasn't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to survive another hour, another day. Food supplies were completely gone. Diseased and dying men lay in trenches, unable to do more than wait for the inevitable. Thousands of soldiers surrendered to the Soviets daily, too weak or disillusioned to go on. On January 31st, 1943, General Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal, likely as a way to pressure him to fight to the death, finally surrendered. He became the first German Field Marshal to surrender to an enemy army. By February 2nd, the Battle of Stalingrad was officially over. The the numbers are staggering. Around 300,000 Axis troops had been encircled in November. By the end of the battle, only about 91,000 soldiers remained alive to be taken prisoner by the Soviets. Most of them wouldn't survive the march to Soviet labor camps. For Hitler, the defeat was catastrophic. The loss of an entire army, and one of his most experienced ones at that, was bad enough. But the real damage was psychological. The myth of German invincibility, carefully curated through Nazi propaganda, was shattered. Even Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister himself, couldn't spin this disaster into anything resembling a victory. Meanwhile, the Soviets had won their most significant triumph of the war so far. Operation Uranus wasn't just a military success. It was a masterstroke of strategy that exploited German arrogance and broke the Wehrmacht's momentum. The encirclement of the Sixth Army wasn't just the downfall of one of Germany's most powerful forces, it marked a turning point for the entire war. The Soviets had demonstrated that they could match and beat the Germans, not just with numbers but with strategy and resolve. From this moment on, the tide of war began to shift, with the German forces forced into a retreat they'd never recover from. For the first time, the unthinkable happened. Nazi Germany admitted defeat. This wasn't just a setback in some minor skirmish. This was Stalingrad, the battle Hitler had fixated on, pouring hundreds of thousands of men into its ruins and declaring it a prize too important to lose. And yet, the Germans lost. Not just the territory, but the something far more important, the myth of their invincibility. For the army, the Nazi regime, and the people back in Germany, the surrender at Stalingrad struck a devastating blow, leaving scars as deep as those on the city itself. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht carried an aura of inevitability. Lightning-fast invasions had smashed through Poland, France, and much of Europe. Even as they pushed deep into Soviet territory, victory still seemed like a matter of time. For those under Nazi rule and anyone watching the war from afar, Germany looked unstoppable. But Stalingrad changed that perception forever. By February 1943, with General Paulus' surrender, it became clear Nazi Germany could bleed. The Wehrmacht wasn't limitless, its men weren't unbreakable, and its leaders weren't infallible. The loss proved that the mighty German war machine could collapse, even under the right conditions. The shock wasn't limited to the battlefield. News of the surrender sent ripples through the German population. Until this defeat, Nazi propaganda had painted the war as an unbroken string of victories. Germany's people were fed a steady diet of triumphs, stories of disciplined soldiers marching to glory. But Stalingrad was impossible to hide. It was too big, too catastrophic to spin into something positive. Even Joseph Goebbels, master of Nazi propaganda, couldn't avoid acknowledging the loss. He admitted that the defeat deflated the German people, and that alone speaks volumes. If Goebbels was struggling to mask the cracks, imagine how deep they were. For many Germans, this was the moment the war shifted from bold victories to desperate survival. The morale at home started to crumble. Families already dreading each knock at the door, letters confirming their loved ones wouldn't return, now faced the reality that the war might not end in victory after all. The myth they'd clung to, a belief in a Germany that could conquer anything and anyone, began to die inside the ruins of a city far away on the Volga River. The psychological toll extended far beyond the borders of Germany. For the Soviets, the victory at Stalingrad wasn't just a military success, it was a massive morale boost. Until this point, much of the war had seen the Red Army on the defensive, scrambling to repel German advances as cities and territories fell into Axis hands. Stalingrad flipped that narrative. For the first time, the Soviets had not just stopped the Nazis, they'd annihilated an entire army. The message was clear. The Red Army could not only fight Germany, they could beat them decisively. The victory became a rallying point, a symbol of Soviet resilience, and a testament to their ability to outlast and outmaneuver even the world's most feared military. The propaganda impact for Stalin was enormous. Stalingrad, a city bearing his name, had withstood everything Hitler could throw at it, and prevailed. This shift in momentum wasn't just felt on the Eastern Front. The rest of the world, especially the Allied nations, took notice. Until then, many in Britain, the United States, and even occupied Europe had wondered whether Germany could be stopped at all. Stalingrad provided an answer. The defeat showed that even the seemingly unstoppable Axis powers were vulnerable. It became a beacon of hope for those who had suffered under Nazi occupation, proving that the tide of war could and would turn. After Stalingrad, the Allies pressed harder. The victory fueled their own campaigns, pushing them to envision an eventual end to Hitler's reign. For the German military, the psychological fallout was immense. In the Wehrmacht, there was a deep-seated belief in their own superiority. Fueled by victories early in the war, German soldiers had been led to believe they were part of an unstoppable force destined to dominate Europe. But the reality of Stalingrad shattered those illusions. Nearly 300,000 men had been cut off and surrounded, forced to endure starvation, frostbite, and isolation, only to crumble. Survivors who made it out as Soviet prisoners faced years of captivity, with many never returning home. Those still on the front lines watched their comrades fall and their supplies dwindle, all while Hitler's refusal to retreat pushed them closer to destruction. Confidence in their leadership, especially in Hitler, took a hit that never fully healed. One vivid symbol of this broken invincibility came through Paulus himself. Promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler, a rank no German general had ever held before surrender in combat, Paulus was meant to die in battle or take his own life rather than admit defeat. That was the expectation. But instead, he chose to surrender, becoming a living reminder of the Wehrmacht's failure. For many German soldiers, the sight of a field marshal, one of their highest-ranking commanders, capitulating to the Soviets dealt a heavy blow. This wasn't a symbolic last stand, it was a collapse, a public, undeniable failure. And let's not forget the Soviet perspective. Victory at Stalingrad wasn't just celebrated, it was enshrined. The city itself, devastated by months of fighting, became a symbol of endurance. It was officially named a hero city, a title meant to remind future generations of the sacrifices made there. For civilians and soldiers alike, Stalingrad provided proof that Soviet resilience could overcome anything, whether it was Nazi invasions or impossible odds. Even as they fought in dire circumstances, with starvation, exhaustion, and constant death, the Red Army had held strong. That unshakable spirit became a defining part of the Soviet identity for decades to come. The historian J. Dimbleby described Stalingrad as a catastrophe for the Third Reich, a shattering blow to its already shaken morale. This wasn't hyperbole. The defeat marked a turning point not just in the war, but in the morale of both the Axis and Allied powers. For Germany, it was the starting whistle for a long, brutal retreat that wouldn't end until the Red Army was at the gates of Berlin. For the Allies, it was proof that Nazi Germany was not invincible, and that victory, even at a colossal cost, was within reach. Stalingrad wasn't just a military disaster for Germany, it was the undoing of a carefully constructed myth. A collapse of the invincible image that Hitler had sold to his people. It showed the world that the Nazis could be beaten and set the stage for the eventual defeat of one of history's deadliest regimes. But the magnitude of this victory, and the war as a whole, came with a price tag no one could ever forget. It's one thing to change the course of history, it's another to count the cost of doing so one life at a time. Over 2 million people fought for Stalingrad. Most wouldn't live to see the end. By the time the fighting finally stopped, the numbers were as staggering as the devastation. Estimates of the total casualty count hover around 1.2 million. That's soldiers and civilians combined. Each one of those numbers represents someone who had a life, a family, plans for the future. A future the Battle of Stalingrad erased. It wasn't just another chapter in the brutal history of World War II, it was one of its most devastating scenes. The German Sixth Army marched into Stalingrad with over 600,000 men. They were the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, experienced and equipped, at least at first. By the end, only 91,000 of them were left to surrender in February 1943. Of those who surrendered, most were already broken men, plagued by frostbite, starvation, or wounds that hadn't seen proper treatment in months. But a surrender wasn't the same as survival. Out of the 91,000 taken, only about 500 would ever make it back to Germany. The rest? Dead in Soviet labour camps, lost along the march out, or simply never accounted for. The grim remains of the German and Romanian soldiers around the city told the rest of the story. Over 250,000 bodies were recovered in and around Stalingrad, silent witnesses to one of the most catastrophic losses in military history. The Soviets didn't escape unscarred. They paid a staggering price as well, one that would be etched into their national memory for generations. Over 478,000 soldiers in the Red Army were killed or went missing during the battle, with an additional 650,000 wounded. Some lost limbs, others their ability to walk or fight ever again. These weren't anonymous numbers. They were farmers, factory workers, brothers, fathers, sons, and that's just the soldiers. The civilian toll, almost impossible to comprehend. Before the bombing raids began, Stalingrad's population stood around 400,000. By the end of the battle, fewer than 40,000 civilians were left in the city. That means 9 out of 10 residents were either killed, evacuated, or missing. For those who stayed, survival often came down to luck. A hidden cellar, a scrap of food scavenged just in time, a random bombing that hit the neighbour's house instead of theirs. The suffering didn't stop once the shooting ended. It clung to those who survived, shaping who they were and what they became. Physically, surviving Stalingrad left scars both visible and invisible. Soldiers returned from the front missing fingers, feet, or entire limbs thanks to frostbite and untreated wounds. Many veterans struggled for the rest of their lives with the physical aftermath of months spent in freezing temperatures with little food and even less medical care. Civilians were no different. Survivors like Valentina Savalieva spent decades searching for closure. Valentina's father disappeared during the fighting, and she spent 10 years searching for his remains, more than half her life tied to the city's devastating legacy. But if the physical scars were brutal, the mental ones were even worse. For the soldiers who made it out, the memories of Stalingrad stayed with them, haunting them even in peace. Imagine spending months in a city where every corner could mean an ambush, where each day was another gamble against starvation, frostbite, or a sniper's bullet. William Hoffmann, a German soldier, captured that descent into despair in his diary. At first, his tone was confident, even proud. But the battle wore him down. His mentions of the Führer became just Hitler, and his writing turned darker with each day, reflecting the hopelessness that had replaced his earlier faith in the campaign. For the civilian survivors, the psychological toll was even harder to define. How do you measure the loss of a home, a community, an entire way of life? Before the war, Stalingrad had been a bustling industrial city. Factories churned out goods, children played in schoolyards, and families crowded into markets. After 5 months of siege, bombings, and brutal combat, the city was reduced to rubble. About 80% of Stalingrad's buildings were completely destroyed. What was left were fragments, broken walls, twisted steel, charred wooden beams, all buried under layers of ash and snow. Survivors wandered streets they no longer recognized, searching for shelter in a place that could barely even be called a city anymore. Even the Red Army's victory left its mark. For every soldier who stood triumphant, there was another dragging a rifle forward in a daze, haunted by what they had endured. And the families waiting back home faced a grief that didn't end when the war did. Wives read the casualty lists, hoping not to find their husband's name. Mothers had to live with the not knowing whether their sons were dead, captured, or still buried somewhere in the rubble of Stalingrad. The long-term impact on the city itself was both physical and symbolic. Stalingrad was rebuilt, technically, but not as it had been. The post-war city bore scars camouflaged as progress. The ruins were cleared, but for decades families stumbled upon unexploded shells or unearthed mass graves while planting gardens or rebuilding roads. A city can move on structurally, but the memories beneath the surface rarely fade completely. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a hero city, a symbol of resilience, defiance, and endurance against impossible odds. For the rest of the world, it was a warning about the human cost of total war. And what a cost it was. The collective loss, millions dead, millions more scarred forever, paints a grim reminder of the true nature of battles like this. Stalingrad wasn't just a turning point in the war. It was an epitaph for the countless men, women, and children who wouldn't see what lay beyond it. It's why the battle echoes in history, less for its victory or defeat, and more for what it said about the sheer depth of human resilience and suffering. So why wouldn't you last a day in the Battle of Stalingrad? Well, maybe now the answer is a little clearer. For most people who are actually there, one day was already too long. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was a brutal reminder of what war demands. It was where strategy met suffering, and where entire armies broke against the will of people who refused to give up. The Soviet victory marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's decline, but the cost was beyond human comprehension. Over 1 million casualties, a city reduced to ashes, and lives forever changed. It's a story of resilience and torment that still echoes today. Take a moment to reflect on those sacrifices, and if you've enjoyed this journey into history, like and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.